Are you dealing with a female narcissist? Mother, sister, maybe a mother-in-law? How about a female narcissist coworker or boss? When you're dealing with a female narcissist, it is so much harder for people to believe you because they've got this whole feminine thing going on where they're going to hide behind a persona that is a lot more believable than often on the other counter side of the male narcissist roles. My name is Tracy Malone, and today I've got a very special guest. Dr. Sheri Heller is going to talk to us about female narcissists and what you need to know if you're dealing with one. So let's welcome Sheri. Hi, Sheri. Thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, hi, Tracy. Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
It is always so much fun, and we just got a little chat before we went on live here, and you know, I could talk to you for hours because we just speak the same narcissist. So today we're going to talk about the female narcissist, and I know that they can be in all kinds of roles. So the romantic, the co-parenting, the divorcing, the mother, the siblings, the aunts, the mother-in-law. You can have them at work. Where do you want to start?
Well, I guess the most classic manifestation of the female narcissist is the femme fatale. You know, there are so many books and films made of, the siren, the seductress, the temptress. Even within theology, we see her, as Lilith. And she is the embodiment of sexuality. You might say she's sort of kind of like this Aphrodite-like type of being. She exudes sexuality. She uses her feminine wiles, her sexuality to procure supply. She love bombs, just like a male narcissist would. But often that is kind of interspersed with her understanding the male psyche, so she knows to feed off of the men's need to feel virile and to feel important, to feel needed. So she might also intersperse her presentation with being somewhat of a damsel. She may want to procure that kind of that supply of needing help or even needing financial assistance. She may be, there's a lot of other hidden agendas. She may be a gold digger. Usually female narcissists do want to procure a certain kind of lifestyle. So they will go after certain men, and they know how to play them, and they play them very well. So once they have the supply secured, then they start to toy with their target. They may start to become histrionic, create fights that aren't there, create issues that aren't really prevalent. They may disappear, go hot and cold, and this starts to create the imbalance and the cognitive dissonance. So they're kind of, I think, prototypical when you think of the female narcissist. But they could also be very subtle.
Yeah. They run the gamut. So, you can have one that is a little bit more covert, a little bit more outgoing, and you can see it. But there's that persona of almost female protection, if you want to say that, where it's hard for people, and I'm talking about my male clients who are here for a female mother, partner, divorcing. Nobody believes them when they tell people what their wife or mother or someone's doing because, you're so sweet. It's hard. It's easier for them to slip into that role that gives them almost a cover.
Right. I think there is a real collective resistance to characterizing women as victimizers of men. I have received a lot of backlash from that. I've written articles about how evil in the human condition will express itself through females as opposed to men. And generally there is a lot of backlash because we look at criminality as mostly pertaining to male behavior, but women can be much more stealth. I mean, most of the people that I treat, I have a client now whose mother definitely had Munchausen, and over a prolonged period of time, basically killed his brother with Down syndrome. These types of behaviors are hidden, carefully hidden behind a facade of maternalism and virtue. Even behind this, as you were saying, this veneer of needing to be taken care of being fragile. So it's all the more insidious and daunting to identify. And, you know, we see the mother as sacrosanct. So the idea of even confronting the mother as someone who is evil, and we scoff at ideas of evil, and you and I talked about that in another podcast about evil. But to me, you know, women really embody that notion that evil is always cloaked in virtue. So the female narcissist really latches onto that, and she plays a role very well, more so than the male narcissist. And I think that's a basic differentiating characteristic, because they're both as malignant, but the female knows how to navigate the ruse, you know, because she's got these gender specific roles that she can hide behind, more so than men.
Absolutely. It's so hard to identify on the outside. Like when you're in it,
Yep.
and it's your mother or your wife or your sister, you can see it quite clearly. It's getting the rest of the world to like either just accept it or, you know, not think you're crazy because you're complaining about your mom or your wife, that even, you know, like I have had many clients where the female narcissist like physically abused them.
Yes, absolutely.
Then the male is sitting here not fighting back and being the good.
Right.
And then everyone says, well, you're the big guy. Like, come on, she didn't
How
do
can it hurt? Right. That's, yeah, it's ridiculed. And there's a feeling of humiliation, and men are very ashamed, and they don't know how to conceptualize what's happening. They often minimize it. So it's interesting for me when I talk about domestic violence with men who are being hit or having things thrown at them by their cluster B partners who are female. It doesn't dawn on them that it's domestic violence. It's hard for them to view it that way. And that starts to become a paradigm shift. That's really important, that they begin to hold the woman accountable for violent behavior. And violent behavior in women, I think, is so surreal to people that even with child abuse, I mean, and most of the people I work with were victims of maternal narcissists. But it's somehow legitimized. It's, I guess, because we're the frail sex, you know, we're the demure sex, or the seemingly the less aggressive gender. These ideas are not applied to us, and that's dangerous.
Extremely dangerous. It's the unfairness of the system as well as common people really understanding and empathizing and not villainizing the man for even making this up. Because they've also had the female narcissist, that public persona that we were talking about, puts them at the soccer game or the best birthday party, and everyone loves them. That's public face. They get home, or they get the kid in the car after soccer, and they're like smacking, throwing things at them. It's really hard for people to break out of that mold that they were before they got in the car.
Yeah, absolutely. And life is a competition for female narcissists. So they have to look the best. They have to seem the best. You know, they really want to be admired, and they have to have that control. And I have a woman I'm working with now who was part of the pageant circuit, and her mother was with both her daughters really so unbelievably competitive and pushing, and behind the scenes so just oppressive. And that's a perfect kind of platform for a narcissistic mother, you know, to be able to have that kind of attention. And that is really the role that the narcissistic mother plays with her daughter. She has to be this narcissistic extension, and has no mind of her own, and has to just be performatory and be this kind of trophy being that is a kind of like a representative of herself. So there is no separation, individuation.
Yeah,
You're taken hostage.
Exactly, exactly. And this can happen with siblings and family members.
Mhm.
It is not limited to divorcing or mothers. You know,
Right.
work, I hear many, many more stories when I coach people that are in a work involved situation. It's 90% people that have a female like
Yeah.
boss doing the destruction.
Yeah. Yeah. Women who are in positions of power up the food chain,
Mhm.
who are narcissistically driven, can be ruthless.
Mhm.
And but often, again, they present as strong women who are well-meaning. I had a client I work with who also came in with PTSD. Couldn't gauge what the hell was going on with her because she really had a very healthy upbringing. And I mean, she had acute PTSD because she was not groomed to be a narcissistic extension. Like myself, or most of the people that I treat who have complex trauma, it's much more excruciating to navigate through narcissistic abuse for that reason, because the antecedent traumas are activated. But she was able to get better in a number of months, and she was like a different person. And that really highlighted for me that it doesn't matter what your background is. Anyone who is targeted by a narcissist can develop post-traumatic stress disorder. And so she was in a company, she was a chemist, and she was in a company that was taken over by a female CEO who was backstabbing her, stealing her clients, had a smear campaign. Basically, the company fell apart. And she had such acute trauma, she had to leave, she had to resign. And I certainly went through that. I mean, the only boss I ever had in the public sector that was a problem for me was a female, an executive director who was a female. I've worked with tons of men who were great, but I had a female narcissist who years later was fired by the board for extorting money.
Mhm.
But she was a great politician, and you know, she was in the philanthropies, she was in mental health, and she seemed like such a just a, you know, a pillar of virtue.
On paper.
On paper.
Let's
Yes.
put that down on paper.
I was miserable. She had a comment on everything I wore.
Mm.
Um,
Wow.
yeah, and then it was funny because we had the licensing board, the Office of Alcoholism and Substance Abuse Services, came in for an audit, and they said to her, they were appalled by my caseload. They said, because I was also supervising, I was in a supervisory role. And they basically read her the riot act, said, you can't do this to her. This is insane.
Mm.
So some people could see through the veneer. And then she fired my supervisor. He was a consultant because he was advocating for me. He couldn't understand what was going on. There was a real disconnect because she demoted me, but I brought the census up with the staff to 110%. And it just wasn't matching. I mean, but I have to say there was a redemptive moment, because when I left, my clients who had worked with me, she had a ceremony because they had sustained remission from their addiction, and the clinic was doing well. And they said, we're not going to do this unless you bring Sheri back. So I was invited to come back, and unbeknownst to her, they had this whole celebration in my honor, which was very humbling and very moving. And she was seething. She was seething with rage.
Yeah, it was,
So it was, yes, it felt like poetic justice. But yeah, I think that happens a lot.
the hardest part when it is a narcissist at work is like your career, everything you've worked for, and you know, generally it's somebody that has been there a long time, and like this is where they've chosen the path, and then someone just comes in and just starts seeing their vulnerabilities and just tears them down, and now your very like livelihood is on the line.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
no matter where the female narcissist lays, so if it's your mother, your livelihood, your life, your future, your, you know, your boundaries, your everything that you have about your soul is got to be untangled from the mess that mothers create. And
Hmm.
it's
Yeah,
a,
they have a lot of power.
yeah. So let's move into the traits of someone who's being abused, because we're talking about how hard it
Yeah.
is to nail them down and go, oh yeah, that's a narcissist. So with a female narcissist, what are the traits that you see in their victims? Are they the same as they would be if they were male victims?
Not necessarily. I mean, I think that you could also consider the mean girl. The prototypical mean girl is the popular female narcissist who loves to target the shy kid, you know, who is vulnerable.
Mhm.
So they particularly will be just tremendously scarred. Will feel there's a lot of fear when you're dealing with someone who is um, gossiping about you and maligning your character, especially if it starts at the high school level.
Mhm.
It all depends on who they want to target, right? So in that situation, you're dealing with someone who is probably predisposed to being very vulnerable. If they're targeting a man who is lonely, you know, well off, but is seeking companionship, um, he's probably going to go into a state of being first initially very enamored
Mhm.
and will be heartbroken and be tenaciously wanting to hold on to the illusory courtship that happened at the onset. And so a man like this is also usually in a position of power to some degree, because the narcissistic female wants someone who they can um, usurp some money from, or you know, have some vicarious status from. So he will feel ashamed. He will start to probably become much more insular, start hiding things, classic syndrome, you know, in a domestic violence situation where people start to become more and more remote. They begin to kind of fall off the grid. Um, there may be some maneuvering on the part of the female narcissist to malign family members or friends, so that the target begins to feel that they're alone. The only person they have, you know, is the narcissist. So the deterioration in that situation is very, it's designed, you know, to kind of dehumanize and to break the person down to a point where I think you would see signs of PTSD, flooding, dissociation, fear, doubting perceptions, a lot of cognitive dissonance. Also enhanced dependency, because attachment becomes greater when there's abuse, you know, because the highs are highs and the lows are lows. So there's, when they get the intermittent reinforcement, you know, when there is an episodic love bombing, or suddenly the narcissist returns from disappearing for a few days, he's euphoric, he's ecstatic, you know. Or even with a woman, I have a client who was married to a woman who was beating her, and who was a severe narcissist. And that happens a lot in the lesbian community and isn't really talked about, the domestic violence in those situations. So, and that I think is probably where it's most severe with men whose mothers are narcissists. I think you see emotional incest. I think you see a lot of men who are browbeaten, who tend to be servile, or who have tremendous commitment issues, often have sex addiction issues, intimacy disorders, have a hard time really forming a life with another outside of their relationship with the mother.
Mhm.
And that becomes very volatile within the marriage. And so you start to see the triangulation really take hold. And
Mhm.
those targets are very torn, because they start to have abandonment panic. You know, they haven't gone through the developmental milestones of being able to adequately separate from their mother, and the narcissistic mother uses that as leverage. In the most severe cases, like with I think it was Daryl, I'm trying to remember his name. He was a comedian on SNL who did a piece called Cracked, a documentary. His mother was extremely severe. She would beat him with hammers. She would, and she was a church lady, right? So she had this veneer of being even religious and virtuous, and he was in and out of hospitals, and she did terrible, terrible things to him. It wasn't until he found a psychiatrist fairly recently who was able to identify the source of his torment as his mother that he was able to stabilize. But he was in and out of mental hospitals his whole life, and was misdiagnosed with bipolar disorder.
Yeah.
So
My mother was a narcissist, and so I think my older sister took the brunt of it, heading towards drugs as escape, but
yeah,
really just no identity of her own. And it is not like she liked my mother. They were like oil and
yeah,
gas, but it's set in a pattern of her life of this helplessness. She just can't do anything on her own. And the self condemnation that they go through, that this is my fault, they internalize it, and it's a very, very hard thing to break when you have had a lifetime of this, being told you're the bad one, you're doing this, you're doing that, and yet they see this crazy behavior and they're getting blamed for it from birth. It's a very hard thing to come out of that door and have a normal life unless you get some
yeah.
So
Yeah, Dr. Carol McBride talks about that a lot, and that's really, she's kind of the pioneer in that arena of mother-daughter dynamics with a maternal narcissist. And she talks a lot about how there is a split in the cluster B mother, and probably it sounds like with your sister, she was the designated scapegoat, the one who carried all the badness, and so she internalized what your mother disowned within herself. And then there's a golden child, or there are different roles that children can play. But yeah, that's really very, very debilitating.
yeah, it's a very scary thing for anybody dealing with a female narcissist. They are evil, hide in the shadows.
Yeah.
They have a public persona that everybody loves. Like you mentioned, someone from church, and high-powered executive. Oh, look at her, she's up there, and yet you don't realize how many bodies she stepped on to get there.
Right. Yeah, I remember years ago I had a session with a woman who was a sweet young woman who was really kind of struggling to want to to identify who she was and to create a life for herself. And her mother was paying for her therapy. Her mother was extremely cruel. She was a Latina, and in Latina community, it's interesting because they're often very histrionic, and that's the only cluster B pathology that actually is related to an ethnic group, to Latino women. It's sort of like a Pedro Almodovar film, where they're like off the charts, women on the verge, very histrionic, very melodramatic, almost kind of the novellas, the Spanish novellas. So her mother came into a session once, and she made my skin crawl. She was the kind of the just exemplary, of the Latina matriarch, and was oozing this false martyrdom and this sense of, being benevolent. But she was there to let me know I'm in charge, I'm in control. Of course, this woman never lasted in treatment, which is really, it's very sad. But I think it is important to really amplify the point that female narcissists are not just people who have some self-indulgent, entitled traits. It runs the gamut, and it could be, and because they have such power as mothers, they can destroy people, and they do.
Yeah, they do, and they destroy marriages, the jealousy.
Yeah.
Children being used as pawns. So if you were used as a pawn as her child, your child's going to come and she's going to use that grandchild to get to you. And it's just an evil game. But what did we miss? Like, what can we tell people if they're in this situation? What's their best like avenue to learn more, to get help, to, speak up when someone's in their presence?
It's difficult because there isn't as much information as there needs to be about female narcissists. I mean, most of the information that's disseminated really focuses on men as narcissists. So when I talk about female narcissism, I'm looking at kind of the cluster B range, which is usually borderline histrionic with strong narcissistic traits. I think we have to get past the labels and look at the behavior, because women who are manipulating in a very kind of manipulative, female, gender specific way are just as malevolent and dangerous as the male counterpart. And I think we need to start to trust our instincts, to see through the facade, through persona, into character. And I guess what I work on the most with my clients initially is trusting their instincts and reclaiming their instincts, because a lot of people, they want to latch on to the fictional narrative. A narcissist will always start out being able to read a person very well. That's what they do for a living. And in a sense, to get supply, they know who to become. They're chameleons. They morph into whatever they need to be in order to dominate and latch on and glean supply. So I find that when they start to play games, people don't want to see it. They have confirmation bias. They see what they want to see. So we have to be willing to question people's motives. And I know that seems to be counterintuitive. It almost sounds like I'm saying be paranoid. But what I'm saying is be intelligently guarded.
Right.
We live in a world where there are many character disordered people, and some have traits and are treatable. I think, though, when we're talking about the more disordered, malevolent, malignant range, I don't feel that that cluster B, people in that cluster B range can necessarily be treated, especially if they are completely devoid of empathy, because then they are not able to, they don't have enough strength to self-examine or to form a bond with a therapist.
Right. Yeah, this has been so helpful. Thank you, Sheri.
My pleasure.
I'm going to give everybody a link to your article that you put on my blog.
Right.
That will let them read a lot more about this. But how do they find you?
My website at sheritherapist.com, and I spell my name SHERI, and therapist is one word. And that's where I have all my articles and all my information. Okay. So I'd be happy to hear from anyone if anyone has any further questions.
Awesome.
I'm always available.
Thank you so much for joining me today. This has been a great discussion. And as I said in the beginning, we could probably talk all day because it's just like, we talk the same language, and I love listening to you because you are a brilliant lady with a lot of real.
Tracy.
Thank you for joining me today.
My pleasure. Thank you. Great to see you.
Well, I hope that you learned something. I'm going to put a link down below to Sheri's article on female narcissist down below in the link. So look for that. And if you've got more questions, feel free to reach out to us. You can look at all kinds of information on my website, which is narcissistabusesupport.com. You can find all kinds of resources, get help, and find your answers. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you again next time.